Can bias training help reduce racial injustice within our nation's police departments? Researchers at Stanford are giving it a try. They say that in most cases, they can determine the race of a person pulled over during a traffic stop just by listening to the words the police officer uses. And now they're sharing those findings with police. NBC News technology correspondent Jacob Ward has the story.
George Floyd, Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, Rashad Brooks. Black men killed by police. Cases that outraged America. Today, black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than are white men. At protests across America, anger and ideas for how to fix the larger problem.
I feel like something's got to change, either with training or something, because they should not be the ones scared of us.
It's almost like we have to train ourselves about how to act in front of the police just so that we don't end up being victims of violence.
In traffic stops, black and Hispanic drivers are also searched more often than white drivers.
The science shows us that all of us have biases baked into our minds. They're part of our most ancient mental programming. And that's why it's so important that all of us, including the police, have to recognize them.
As part of an upcoming PBS documentary shot before the pandemic, I met with Stanford sociologist Jennifer Eberhardt and her team, who analyzed police body cam footage to help police departments across the country identify and eliminate their biases in the field.
What kinds of patterns do you think you could detect?
Well, we want to look to see, for example, if African Americans are treated any differently from white Americans during these stops.
What they found was eye-opening. In their analysis of over 1,000 traffic stops, they found that white drivers were told much faster than black drivers why they were being stopped. White drivers tended to be addressed more respectfully as sir or ma'am, while black drivers were more often called things like man or bro. White drivers also received more reassurances from officers, while black drivers got more probing questions and were told far more frequently to keep their hands on the wheel.
A surprising fact is that if we just look at the words that were used by the officer, we can predict the race of the person that they're talking to about 2/3 of the time.
Wow, even if you don't know the race of the person that was stopped, you can tell it from how that person was spoken to.
Black person or a white person.
The Stanford team is now sharing its findings with police departments across the country and training officers to become more aware of their own biases.
We all suffer from that. We all have it. So it's not something to avoid or be defensive about, but it's something to understand.
Experts say it's a critical step toward changing the assumptions police can make about people of color and the horrors that can result.
Senate Republicans laid out their vision for police reform today. Tim Scott, the Senate's only black Republican, took the lead on the bill.
We find ourselves at a place with a package that I think speaks to the families that I spoke with yesterday who lost loved ones. We hear you.
Meanwhile, the House Judiciary Committee, led by Democrats, is marking up its own police reform bill today. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Hake joins me now. Garrett, what's in the Senate GOP plan here?
Hey, Allison, a couple things. They try to use federal dollars to incentivize police departments to change the way they operate in a couple of key areas. One would be banning chokeholds by linking it to federal grant dollars. There's also things in there like reporting requirements for use of force, creating a database so that fired police officers, their records can be discovered by other jurisdictions that might hire them. There are a number of policies that are not in this bill that do appear in the Democratic version that have caused some consternation, including there's nothing in this bill about qualified immunity. That's the ability of an individual to sue a police officer or a police department for use of force incident. That's probably the single biggest change. And then I think realistically, as we look at these two bills side by side, we should think about it this way. Most of the things that the Senate bill does, it does with incentives for police departments, essentially saying, we'll give you money if you do X. Most of the way that the Democratic bill handles things is to try to essentially mandate federal standards from the top down. We will absolutely forbid you from doing the same X.
All right, Garrett, let's talk about how this plan is different from the bill that House Democrats introduced about a week or so ago.
Yeah, qualified immunity is the big one here. This is the opportunity to sue police departments. I think that's probably the single biggest part of this. The reality is the Democratic bill goes a lot further in a number of areas. It provides, more penalties. It's more aggressive. It's got more enforcement mechanisms in, and you're hearing from a lot of Democrats who say the Republican measure just doesn't go far enough. For example, on chokeholds, this is about grant money. It's not a ban. That they're essentially trying to give our departments the opportunity to improve themselves, but not the requirement. And so I think that's where we're seeing things sort of break down here.
Garrett, let's talk about that. You mentioned Democrats have an outright ban on practices like chokeholds. The Republicans are incentivizing police not to use them. Here's what Senator Scott said about that.
Well, certainly, I think we achieve some of the same ends by our approach. Frankly, if you think about the inability to have any grants if your department has chokeholds, that frankly is by default a ban on chokeholds.
Do we know why the Republicans are going about it this way?
I think one of the things to pay attention to here is the way the Republicans have tried to court law enforcement as they move on this, try to keep law enforcement on their side in this. You heard a lot about this from the president the other day. There's just differences in how they discuss this issue. For example, you'd be very hard-pressed to find many of these Republican lawmakers who would even admit that there is a problem of systemic racism in law enforcement. And so I think what you're trying to see is Republicans move forward on reforms that don't offend the officers and the departments that are, at least in their view, an important part of their own electoral groupings here. So you're seeing Republicans try to handle this a little bit more gently on those issues, and I think that's probably part of the reason why.
All right, Garrett, so the big question is here, will Congress be able to get something passed? Does it look like the two parties can find some common ground, come to an agreement eventually here? Because it does seem like they aren't exactly on the same page right now.
No, they're not. Look, here's what I think will happen. The House is moving forward pretty quickly on their bill, and because it's the House, they can do things with a simple majority. So what I think we're likely to see happen is House Democrats passing that House Democratic bill. It's still an open question of whether the Senate bill will even get to the floor. You actually need some Democratic votes to make that happen. But let's imagine for a minute that it does. Any bill that would pass the Senate would probably need to go to conference then with the House. I don't think you're going to get a Senate bill out of that body that looks anything like the House bill. So if you end up passing two things that are functionally quite different and kicking it over to to a conference committee, you might shrink down the total number of things that those bills deal with. But maybe perhaps they can find an agreement on a narrower set of principles. We're still a ways from that, but I think the deadline here is probably that 4th of July break, because as we know from long history, when Congress goes home for an extended period of time, they tend to take their eye off the ball on these sorts of issues, and that could be fatal to this effort.
Yeah, I mean, you've been saying it throughout the week, Garrett, right? There's that break, and then all of a sudden we're into the fall, and the election isn't that far off. So I know there is certainly an incentive to get things done sooner rather than later. Garrett Haake on Capitol Hill, thank you so much.
Thanks, Allison.
We're waiting to hear whether the district attorney in Atlanta will charge the officers involved in the shooting death of Rashad Brooks. NBC News correspondent Katie Beck is joining me now from Atlanta. And Katie, do we have any sense of how prosecutors might be leaning here?
Allison, we don't. What we do know is that the DA, Paul Howard, is taking this case extremely seriously. He has said this is one of the most important decisions he will ever make. And he has taken his time to review ballistic evidence, body cam video, surveillance video, to sort of be able to try and assess how threatened these officers' lives were and how they felt at the moment that they fired those fatal shots. That's going to be determining what charges he brings, if any, and whether or not they are brought against one officer or both. So those answers we expect to hear just momentarily. We are actually watching that podium very closely. This press conference is set to start at 3 o'clock, and we should have some answers very soon as to what he plans to do.
Katie, we've seen the police body cam footage, surveillance video from Wendy's. I know those are key pieces of evidence here. Is there other evidence that investigators are looking at? Do we know?
Well, I think in most of these cases, they also review the personnel files of the officers to find out, was there a pattern? Yep. Were there other similar incidents in their past? And this week, digging into the former officer, Garrett Rolfe, who is accused of shooting Rashad Brooks, he did have at least a dozen incidents in his personnel file, one for the misuse of a firearm and several other citizen complaints. So this wasn't the first time that Rolfe had been on the radar for perhaps stepping outside of the lines. I think there is a cumulative picture that they tend to look at, but they are mostly looking at the evidence from the scene that night and whether or not those officers felt reasonable threat to use excessive force.
We can see the Wendy's behind you where he was killed last week. I could see plenty of folks there behind you as well. What's it been like there today?
Well, as this decision has approached and gotten nearer, the crowd here has grown larger and louder. There are certainly way less people here this morning, but as we've approached the 3 o'clock hour, we've seen lots of people showing up. This has been sort of a site of remembrance for folks coming here to remember Rashad Brooks. We have seen a steady flow of people coming in and out of that parking lot, but now it is very clear that the masses there are growing and that they are awaiting this decision and will be likely reacting. So far, the past 2 nights in Atlanta have shown nothing but peaceful protests and demonstrations. That coming after the Atlanta mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, put out a very strong statement about her police reforms that she wanted to implement immediately. That seemed to have a positive effect on protesters in the past 2 days. What will be the effect of this oncoming decision? We'll have to wait and see.
All right, we are awaiting that press conference from the district attorney in Atlanta any moment now. Katie Beck, thanks so much for getting us up to speed in the meantime.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.